Monkey love is totally different than the way you have love for your child.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Decoding TV bonus episode. I am David Chen. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Klepek, and today we are going to be discussing the HBO documentary series Chimp Crazy. Chimp Crazy just finished airing its 4 episodes on HBO. It's currently streaming on Max, the one to watch for HBO. I'm going to read a plot summary from the internet. Former nurse turned exotic animal broker Tanya Haddock spends her days caring for animals in captivity, referring to herself as the Dolly Parton of chimps. However, her limitless love for one chimpanzee spins into a wild cat and mouse game with authorities and an animal rights group. End quote. It is directed by Eric Goode, the guy who created Tiger King on Netflix. Obviously, a show that I think many of us got enthralled by during the around the beginning of the pandemic. And here he's applying his same eye to this woman, basically, and these other people who are kind of in this woman's network who like to keep and breed chimps and potentially sell them as well. So, Patrick Klepek, real quick, we're going to do like a quick overview, reaction, and then talk about some of the more thornier ethical questions and details that this documentary brings up. But what did you think of the show? Do you think people should watch Chimp Crazy?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's worth watching. I think it's excellently made, raised a lot of interesting questions, both from how it was made and the subjects that it's covered. But at its most basic, I found it to be a very surprisingly empathetic portrait of some very complicated people who are doing inarguably evil things, and yet does not portray them as just paper thin cartoon villains, but as very complicated people whose emotions are not as simple as I want to harm this animal for my own joy. And I found that to be the most interesting part of what happens across these 4 episodes, is trying to understand why. And unlike a lot of documentaries, I think by the end, it actually answers that question. You may not feel good about it, but it answers the question of why.
It is extremely compelling watching, in my opinion. I was trying to get you onto the show, and I was like, I was trying to explain. I was like, it is wild and crazy, and I don't know that I could fully convey what it is, but it is undeniably compelling because, what you said, he kind of presents these people as pretty full human individuals, while at the same time you are incredibly disturbed by a lot of what you're seeing and what's going on. I also think that he does a lot of really ethically questionable things during the making of this documentary that must be called out. And I can understand if you disagree with his approach to this documentary, like just dismissing the documentary out of hand. I understand like people who feel that way. But for me, I think it is worth considering. It's a fascinating piece of work. And I would recommend people watch this docuseries. Let's get into it. I mean, just as a narrative, Patrick Klepek, I have to say, it's very effective filmmaking. Like each of the episodes leaves with a cliffhanger of sorts. The reveal, for instance, right? Like the idea, by the way, is that this woman, Tanya Haddock, has been keeping these chimps in pretty much inhumane, unsafe conditions. These people who raise these chimps have no particular expertise in chimp raising. And so these chimps are being kept in like not optimal conditions. Of course, they feel differently about that. And so PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, has gotten a bunch of Tanya Haddock's chimps removed from her care, except for one who happened to star in an Alan Cumming movie called Buddy many decades ago, named Tonka. Tanya Haddock claims Tonka died. And so all these other chimps were removed, but Tonka died, and so that's why he wasn't removed from Tanya Haddock's care. And a lot of people are skeptical that Tonka is dead. And she doesn't seem to be able to provide convincing evidence that Tonka has died and was cremated. And then at the end of episode 2, so we should say we're spoiling the whole show, Chimp Crazy now. At the end of episode 2, it is revealed that Tonka is alive. And she's been keeping Tonka in a basement somewhere. That is shocking. And then what is also shocking are several other things. One of which is, of course, the documentary filmmaker behind this, Eric Goode. Tiger King so tainted his reputation that he was basically unable to get people to call him back to make this documentary for him. So he had to hire a surrogate, Arrested Development style, to pretend to be the actual filmmaker. Now, Patrick Klepek, I am really curious. What did you think about this?
I understand the criticisms against the approach, but having seen the full work
Yeah.
and the story that it tells, if I'm to sit and ask myself, was the deception taken in order to tell this story worth it? Like, I think it was. And I understand dismissing it out of hand. I'm a longtime reporter myself. I do less journalism these days than I did when I was younger.
Would you ever use deception to get what you deem to be an important story? Right, is the question.
I mean, this is like such outright, like this is like, so, I mean, like
this is the worst it gets. Basically, you're literally pretending you're another physical human being, right?
Yeah, it's pretty brazen, but I can't. What rubs up against it is like, if you just present me with that, like, should you lie about who you are in order to pursue the truth of a story? No, and yet it did happen here. The documentary doesn't hide it. It sort of embraces that thorny question and presents it to the audience up front. Why are we doing this? Like, what is the goal of doing it this way? You can take issue with doing it at all, but it's not as though it's treated as a twist or a cliffhanger. And like, by the way, from the creators of Tiger King, like, he's offsite at a production facility. It explains its motivations, its approach, and the story it's able to tell as a result of the intimacy. Part of the reason I think it works is the person they choose to be the surrogate, right? Like, this person is able to achieve a level of intimacy with the subjects to portray, like, ultimately to allow the documentary to portray these people as full people, that if I find myself getting wishy-washy on the ethics of it, because ultimately I think the work itself feels like it had noble aims.
Right.
And
feels like I agree with you. I think here are some other facts, right? Tanya Haddox has stated that if she knew that it was this guy, she never would have participated.
Correct.
We have to imagine that this guy Eric Good, the filmmaker, financially benefited in some way from selling this documentary to HBO, right? And so, those are undeniable elements of this that make it feel, in my opinion, more icky. That said, Tanya Haddox was engaged in the committing of what seems to be multiple crimes during the course of this documentary, and so it's like that also has to be weighed. And she was treating Tonka, in my opinion, inhumanely, right? Like, can you imagine if Tonka was a person, right? She was locking this person in her basement. She would never go in the cage herself because like, if he gets moody or whatever, he's dangerous. She can't let other people see him because she's worried about him being discovered. So it's like his existence is really sad. I was reading the Rolling Stone article about what happened with Tonka, and it's like sometimes, like, these chimps, and you see some of this footage in the show, they'll like hit themselves, or they'll like bang the bars, or they'll make noise because they just need some stimulation of even if it's like hurting themselves, because they're just kept in this room all day. It's really horrifying what she's done to these creatures. And so I kind of ultimately agree with you, Patrick, but I didn't feel great about it. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that's why I think this story could have been capturing. Could I think it had been captured playing by the book? No.
Yeah.
I do not think.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes to you, like the viewer.
Yeah. Does that mean we shouldn't have captured it at all, right?
It's like, what, was it worth not capturing all? Was what we get at the end, these 4 episodes, worth what happened along the way? I ended up saying yes. Part of that was because I think this show and this documentary, it involves the creators, but does not center them. I feel like it involves them when it is necessary to wrestle with some of the questions. I've read, I think it was a piece on Vulture that like took issue with like, well, they do it very quickly and then they move them off camera. And like, fine, we can quibble over whether they spend enough time with the filmmakers wrestling with their own ethical dilemmas. I was fine with the amount that it was there. I was fine with the amount that the filmmakers were present without feeling as though they were becoming characters in the story themselves. I felt like there was a good balance between trying to have all those things present. I felt they addressed them full enough for you as a viewer to then make a full opinion yourself on whether this was worth it and the people along the way made the right calls. And at every turn, I more or less felt like, yeah, this seems right. And to hear this story in full with this intimacy, I felt like it was worth the risks they took, the kind of ethical like lines they walked or walked over, frankly, along the way. But that's easy to say once having seen the whole thing, and you don't know if a story is going to be worth it
during it.
Told.
You might have felt like if someone came to you during it and told you about this, you might have felt differently. I will say this: I don't agree. Here's where I will agree with you. I think the filmmakers tried to keep themselves off screen as much. Like they tried to not be involved as much as possible. That's where I'll agree with you. I think ultimately the story does center them in a huge way.
Sure.
But I will agree with you that they that's not what they preferred to have.
It's not a Jinx situation, right? Where
yeah.
And it would have been very.
Actually, I think it becomes that. It literally
does become that. But I guess the difference is, I feel like one set of filmmakers went, "Let's go," and another set of filmmakers went, "Our hands are being forced."
Right, exactly.
There's no way to.
Like, yeah, I mean that's the story. That's their version of the story.
Sure,
Tanya Haddock's version of the story is a little different, but like, and we're only really seeing their side in this documentary. But I mean, let's talk about it, right? What ends up happening is that essentially she's trying to pretend that Tonka is dead. The filmmakers realize Tonka is alive, and they need to weigh whether or not to reveal this information to PETA and to the courts. And ultimately, the filmmakers in Chimp Crazy decide they're going to reveal that information. That ends up getting Tonka removed and taken to like a chimp sanctuary or whatever. And, Tanya Haddock gets hit with a bunch of legal bills and potentially might be charged for perjury and all this other stuff, right? So like, the filmmakers ended up having a material impact on the outcome of this story. I was thinking a little bit about Civil War, the Alex Garland movie. Did you see that movie, Patrick Klepek?
It's on my list. I've gotten behind on things, but as someone who's been a reporter, I've heard especially that angle is really interesting in that.
Well,
movie.
There's a moment in Civil War where like they're talking about what is the responsibility of a journalist, and Kirsten Dunst's character, who is a photojournalist, says. It's not our job to ask the questions. It's our job to take the picture so that other people can ask the questions. Right? That's how she conceptualizes the role of the journalist. And I feel as though Eric Goode and his filmmakers are struggling with that question in this documentary as well. Like, what is our role here? Is it to document what is going on? Or is it to actually prevent something horrible from happening? Right? And I honestly had a lot of sympathy for them because, like, as Eric Goode tells it, the thing that really got him up off his ass and like being like, we got to tell people about Tonka being alive is when Tanya Haddock said that she's thinking of euthanizing Tonka, who, by the way, has since been assessed for health and is apparently going to live for another 20, 30 years. Right. But she was thinking of euthanizing this chimp. And so then Jonathan is like, okay, or Eric Goode's like, we got to do something because if we don't, she's going to kill this chimp. And then what's the documentary going to be at that point? Like, you documented her killing this chimp,
right.
Like it threatens the kind of integrity of the work at that point as well. It certainly threatens the marketability of the work, right? And so they intervened, and that is the other major ethical quandary that this documentary finds itself in. Is it took a role in the story, and I think people can have different opinions about this, right? Like, should documentarians actually try to do good in the stories that they're documenting? Patrick Klepek, do you have a philosophy about this?
I mean, I think everyone's line is going to be different, right? And I think, when you are a journalist, like, you have different obligations. It's not strictly to the truth, right? Like, when you are working with sources, like if you are working with anonymous sources, you have an obligation based on the rules you've parameters you've set up with the people you're talking to over like how involved do you want to be in a story? Are you okay if you end up getting outed and potentially losing your job as a result of an association with the story? And so you set up you do your best to sort of set up those parameters ahead of a story moving forward so that everyone involved feels as though they have a sense of the weight and the gravity and the rules. Obviously, Tanya Haddix did not have a full sense of that. It's not as though she was being secretly recorded, though, right? Like Correct. She knew she was being recorded for a documentary. The context she didn't know was that it was the creative behind Tiger King, and thus was probably going to be deeply critical of what she was doing. But it's not as though there were just secret cameras set up. Right. I mean, the facility.
The surrogate did tell her, "Hey, don't say anything to camera you don't want out into the world." Right. Right. And so that she did get that warning. But the question, Patrick, is about the journalist. I'm asking you about the journalist. Like this, like Jason Schreier, like he covers terrible working conditions in video game companies, right?
Yeah.
This would be like Jason Schreier, actively intervening in the company to try to stop them from like working their employees too hard.
Do that, that is part of the work though, right? Like that is, I mean, the difference there is
it'd be like him making a call and I guess that's inherent.
You do that though. You do that. Like that's functionally what you were doing when you were collecting a body of work and explaining it into a piece. With the difference, the version you're doing here is like, let's say you were reporting on like a sexual assault and sexual harassment within a company, and I don't know, like somehow became into possession of information of like someone was planning to like do something to someone. Like, do you not report that information because you know what I mean? Like I think I don't know what journalism schools would tell you on that front, but like when I have reported, when you report out, toxic behavior with companies, you are ultimately doing so with the intent of like, you're not just telling the story to, well, these are some funny stories I found on the ground. Right. I guess I should put them as like you're doing so to sort of paint a narrative to empower like a sense of however that change plays out is not necessarily for you to say, but you are collecting these because you think they are interesting. You have made the personal judgment, this is wrong, and I'm putting these together to tell a cohesive narrative that can hopefully enact some form of change. How that change plays out, what the punishments are, beyond me. But I'm putting the information together because I've made the personal judgment that what's happening here is wrong. Now, there are times where I've had a couple of stories where I spent weeks, months reporting out very credible allegations against individual, in which I never published those stories. I spoke to people who claim to be deeply affected in many different ways that I was not able to get stories like that across the finish line through a lawyer. And so what happens to those stories? Well, they never got told, or they're left to do that on their own on places like social media. But the thousands of words I wrote trying to turn that into a narrative, I could not get over the finish line with lawyers. And so they just turn into a draft that eventually expires in an abandoned Google account. And I don't publish that stuff. I haven't gone on to publish that material because that doesn't feel ethically right either. But it also doesn't feel great that like, oh, I watched a story die on the vine. People trusted me with things that happened to them, and a lawyer told me no. What are you supposed to do there?
I think what you're saying is that what they did in this documentary, in your opinion, is not at all fundamentally incompatible with the basic concept of
harm. Like it is like a grenade has been put in your hand.
Right.
And I don't know. I bet there would be. My guess is there are reporters who would take harder lines. Like, no, like you're there to watch what she does.
Right.
And at some point, if PETA figured it out on their own, let PETA figure it out on their own. I would not make that decision. I would have done exactly what the person did in this situation. Was like this is a line too far for me. Like this is what I think he mentions at some point, Eric Good. Well, if we kept following her and didn't report it, like where do we think the story is going? What's like the next step in this narrative that we're hoping to capture? And he says something to the effect of, well, I've always believed there were other people that like other bad, like a network of bad actors
enabling her or whatever.
But whether the documentary chooses to not like include those characters or clue us into that. At no point in the documentary to this point do we have the sense that that's their aim or they suspect it's out there. They just sort of vaguely believe, well she's clearly not working alone.
To be fair, they explore this other woman. I think Connie Casey is her name, right? Like that Tanya Haddox was like associated with. There's other friends that help.
But there's not
Tanya.
like a ladder we're climbing. There's not like a big boss at the end. That,
right.
Like,
it's not like you're trying to get to like Tony Soprano at the end.
Right. Where it's like we got to be with her long enough because we know figure A who's on her phone
Client
is like
9, right?
Well, yeah, it's like the grandmaster behind all. Like there was no sense that like by outing her you were losing the opportunity to get to something that was going to be transformative for the lives of these chimps or the other people affected.
Yeah, at the end of the day, having said all this stuff, I think I'm more bothered by the lies about who, like, actively misrepresenting who he is than about this. Now that you're in the story, it's like, yeah, where is the story going?
Right.
What do we think is going to happen? And as you said, they're actively like, what is the point of making this in the first place? It's to prevent bad things from happening, right? It's to prevent people like this from abusing animals. And if you have a case where like that might be happening, where she's going to kill an animal, and you do nothing to stop it, then what's the point of making the work in the first place? So I think I agree with that at the end of the day. It's the other deception I think I have a bigger issue with, because I think people should know if someone approaches you, like people should have some confidence of who you say you're representing, which she did not have in this situation.
Did you, I forget if this was really ever clarified in the documentary, but like the surrogate that was being sent in, like he didn't have an earpiece that he was actively listening to Eric Good during the whole time. Like he had enormous.
It's
so
unclear.
that was a question that I had, because I do think that is an important distinction if we're getting into the weeds on the ethics of this.
Right.
Yes, he's the director of the documentary, but and yes, we're calling this a surrogate, but the way the documentary presents this person is they are granted a broad amount of. They're kind of given like mission objectives, like here's what we'd like to like ask her about this, but like they give him broad autonomy over like once you're in there, you're the guy, like you're like it's surrogate. There was often a feeling like this is a freelance contractor. We've hired someone. You know what I mean? Like I because it's not as though this documentary portrays the surrogate as somebody who is just repeating beat for beat, word for word, what Eric Good wants to say at all times. Like it is not a robot that is being controlled. Like the documentary goes out of its way to present him as a pretty full person as well. And as an active participant who has feelings, emotions, complicated, like he is not removed from the story. And I think they go to great lengths to include him, perhaps to protect themselves from like these ethical questions. But I found myself falling on in like, this seems more like they hired a contractor to go. There's still deception, but he was not a robot. He was not someone just sent in with a list of questions word by word to repeat to these people. They mostly hired somebody to go be a part of their lives. And deception was still involved, but it's not as simple as Eric Good was just a puppet behind the scenes saying exactly this is what should happen next. And I do think that complicates things.
I think that's fair. Yeah. And if he's just some guy that Eric Good hired to kind of go in there and mix things up, then it's like that is a little bit different. Again, still misrepresenting like who is actually controlling all this. And I thought it was very funny when the journalist from Rolling Stone reveals like, I did some digging into who the filmmaking company is, and that led me to, well, you, the person who's asking me these questions right now. Amazing moment. And then it cuts to like Eric Good, asking the questions. I thought that was very a pretty great moment in the documentary. So I think the only other things I wanted to say are, number one, to address the point you made earlier about like why these people do this, right? Why do people like Tanya Haddox raise these chimps? It's basically there's something missing in these people, right? There's some hole that they have in their soul, and the idea of having a baby-like creature, aka a chimp, that will always depend on them, that never grows up, is appealing to them. It fulfills some deep, somewhat disturbing need that they have. to the point where they are blind to the damage that they're doing, not only to the chimp, but also to the people around them. And I think that's like ultimately the sort of portrait I'm left with of these people. Patrick Klepek, what do you think?
Yes, this is what I found to be the most profoundly moving part of the whole series. Was like, in some ways, it is trying to capture like, why are we all like, what is the value in living? How do we all individually find happiness in a life that is like broadly undefined? You're just sort of thrust into it. And part of the appeal of being a parent is the children have no choice. And I mean that in the sense that like they're just in the world, they look to you, and the only way they can navigate it at the earliest stages is to rely on you. And I've always struggled with that part of parenting. Like when people are like, why do you want to be a parent? It's like, I don't have a great answer on that, because it feels sort of weird in the beginning where it's like, well, the kids don't have a choice to come into the world. You bring them into the world, and then they're entirely reliant on you. And it feels really good. Like to have someone want you, desire you, care about you, love you unconditionally out of the context of sort of who you are and what you've done. That is extremely powerful and intoxicating. And one of the most difficult parts of parenting is grappling with the sense that that will eventually go away. And it's part of why people have multiple kids. Not because you don't love your children as they get older, but man, that period where they're entirely dependent on you, it is so naturally fulfilling in a way that is stripped of all of the complications of like all the other relationships in your life. Because it's just pure. It is just, they need you and they don't have a choice. And that can kind of spin it in a dark sort of sense, but it is one of the most profoundly satisfying parts of being a parent, is like being able to care for something, like to love something unconditionally and be there for it. But then what happens here is these people they cannot grip with, they cannot accept something becoming its own person, becoming full, having autonomy. And that is a huge part of being a parent, is wrestling with, preparing with, accepting, and being happy for. You played a role in something's life so that it could become something else. And then it's their choice whether you get to remain as part of that life. And the darkness at the center of Chimp Crazy is that these chimps don't get that choice. They're never given the autonomy to have their own lives, to experience the world outside of the constraints of the mother sort of like child relationship. And so I wrestle with like, man, I get it. Like I see how you end up here.
Right.
It's horrible.
Put a different way. It's like, what if you never had to deal with that feeling of giving up this person to their own autonomy, right? What if there was a creature that could give you that feeling of need, like someone is depending on me forever, right? How intoxicating would that be? And these people clearly fell prey to it, of their own volition. But yeah, deep stuff, Patrick Klepek. I was very emotional hearing you talk about that just now.
But that's what it's what I find. Like again, these people are have done a horrible thing. Like they are participating in an egregious act. And it's part of what I found so moving about the series was that because it captures the why. Like again, I do not think like these chimps should be free. These organizations, these networks should be shut down. These people should find other ways to find value in their life to fill these holes, or to accept, as other parents do, it will not be filled. At least not until your kids have grandparents, and then you get to experience that again. But that's part of life, is like it changes, and what makes you happy and fulfilled is different. And I appreciated the why on this. Was like, I understand why they did what they did. They shouldn't do it. It should be taken away from them. It should be dismantled. Many of them should probably go to jail. But it does answer the why in a very empathetic, moving way that you don't always see in. I certainly didn't feel that way in Tiger King. And sometimes there isn't a why, right? Like sometimes there isn't a why, or capturing that isn't possible. And And the one thing I guess I'll give against the documentary is, do we have a sense of when it goes to the other folks in this community, like the other characters that also have similar relationships with their chimps that Tanya Haddix does, is that Eric Goode doing the interviews? The surrogate is only for Tanya Haddix?
Unclear as far as I know. I don't know.
Because you could make like obviously Tanya Haddix is a very compelling character. We get the most time spent with her, the most intimacy and inside look at why she feels the way she does. But these other people in the community very quickly opened up emotionally about why they feel the way they do about these chimps. And that maybe gives you an argument. Was there a way to tell this story that still got at the why without the deception? If it's true that Eric Goode was the one doing that, I don't know about that. But stripped away from all of this, I thought it was a very moving story that, again, like I said, captured why are these people doing these monstrous acts? And it does. And I found that, like you said, very compelling.
All right. I don't know of any better way to end it than that, Patrick Klepek. Anything else you want to say about this documentary?
No, it's if you're gonna pick one, like Tiger King is intoxicating in its own way. I feel like this one has a lot more.
It's a far
better work
piece of work.
One's
right?
popcorn,
right?
And then the other is a little more of a meal. And I think this is the better. It certainly. I'll be following whatever. Like I got to the end of Tiger King, wasn't like I need to see what this filmmaker is up to next. I got to the end of this, and like whatever he is working on next, which I'm sure is years off. Like this stuff takes time. It's now on my radar. Like, what will you think is an interesting subject to capture next? Like, I'll be first in line to watch.
Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.